Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my January wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of January 2025. So I read 10 books in January, some really excellent ones that I'm excited to tell you about. But before I get into the books, I thought I would do a quick goals check-in. So as I said in my 2025 goals video, I'll leave that link down below. I have some particular goals that are really important to me this year that I'm going to be working really hard on. I've tried to make my goals a bit more focused this year, and I thought maybe it would be fun to, at the start of every monthly wrap-up, talk about how I'm doing with those goals and have a quick check-in about that. It may be that I forget to do this in future monthly wrap-ups, or that it feels too pressured to do that because, I don't have to make progress on the goals every single month, but I thought it might be an interesting thing to do. So of the 13 books by Anthony Trollope that I want to read in 2025, I read 1 in January. Of the 19 books on my TBR that have been there for too long that I want to read in 2025, I read 2 in January. Those are 2 of my big goals for the year. Then my third big goal for the year is to read more internationally, including more in translation. And this month I read from 4 different countries: the UK, the US, France and the Philippines. And 1 book I read was in translation. The rest were all originally written in English. So, okay, but I hope there will be months where I am doing better on that goal. But anyway, I'm pretty pleased with that for the first month in the year. Right, let me talk about the books that I read in January, and I will start, as I often do, with some classics. So the translated novel that I read in January was The Three Musketeers by Alexander Dumas. I did actually technically finish this on the 1st of February, but I'm sure you'll forgive me for including it in my January wrap-up. I did read most of it in January, and I listened to the audiobook narrated by Patterson Joseph, which was really fantastic. He's also an author. He wrote The Secret Diaries of Charles Ignatius Sancho, which I highly recommend as well. And he's a great actor and voice actor as well. And I really liked that audiobook. I would really recommend it. Although the one complaint I do have is that I can't find out who this edition was translated by. It doesn't say anywhere on Audible or within the credits of the audiobook who translated it from French. So I'm slightly bemused about that, but it was a very good audiobook. I read this for the Reading the Globe read-along hosted by Katja from Page Turners with Katja. I'll link more information about that down below. And The Three Musketeers was the pick for January and February, so if you want to join in, you still have a month to do so. I really enjoyed The Three Musketeers overall. I didn't love it as much as The Count of Monte Cristo, but I did think it was really fun. And I also think it's quite fun in the sense that the first half is quite silly and light-hearted, and then in the second half things get a bit darker in a way that I quite liked. So The Three Musketeers is about a young man called D'Artagnan who's 19, 20 years old, and he goes to Paris to make his fortune, gets a position in the guards, and he makes friends with 3 musketeers who are in the King's Musketeers. So D'Artagnan is not one of the 3 musketeers, but his 3 best friends are the 3 musketeers, and we're following what happens when D'Artagnan and his 3 friends get involved in all kinds of adventures and political intrigues and various other things. So The Three Musketeers came out in 1844. It's written in the 19th century, but it's set in the 17th century. So it's work of historical fiction. And what it kind of reminded me of was historical James Bond, by which I mean it's quite silly. There's lots of indiscriminate killing of unimportant characters, and also there's lots of the main characters seducing lots of women. In general, the gender stuff in The Three Musketeers is not great, and it was quite interesting. There were even a few moments where Alexander Dumas, writing this in 1844, had to add a line being I appreciate this isn't a very chivalrous and appropriate way to treat a woman, but it was the past, so they did things differently then, which I thought was fascinating. I always enjoy reading historical fiction from the past and looking at the way that people at certain points in the past viewed the past before them. But yeah, the book's view on gender, both in terms of its position on women and also on what is heroic behaviour for a man, wasn't great. But it didn't really get in the way of my reading enjoyment, partly because, it was written a long time ago, but also because there is a female villain in it, and she is just fantastic. And I was definitely on her side a lot of the time when I wasn't meant to be on her side. But I feel the way Dumas wrote her, he must have known. He must have known what a compelling character she is. Like I said, I was on her side a lot of the time, rather than on the side of the men. And there's definitely a lot in her character of that kind of 19th century idea of, oh look, the horror of an immoral woman, how much more terrifying than an immoral man. Reminded me a bit of Jezebel within Jezebel's Daughter from Wilkie Collins. But despite all that, she's a really fascinating, psychologically complex, compelling character. And I don't think Dumas wrote her like that by accident. So I kind of love that about the book. Like, even if I feel like my opinions on her were not what they were meant to be, or not what Dumas would have envisioned them being, I still had a wonderful time reading about her. Overall, I really enjoyed The Three Musketeers. I don't think it is as incredible a novel as The Count of Monte Cristo, but it is a lot shorter. So if you want to give Alexander Dumas a try, then I don't think it's a bad place to start. And it's very funny in places, which was very enjoyable. And yeah, I just had a great time reading it. Then the Anthony Trollope book I read in January was one of his final books, published in 1882. This is The Fixed Period. And this was a weird novel, like a really unusual Anthony Trollope book. Probably one to read for an Anthony Trollope completionist rather than like one you must read. But if the premise sounds interesting to you, maybe give it a go, because it's very odd and very unlike most of Trollope's books. So The Fixed Period is set in the future. It was written in 1882, but it's set in the 1960s, 1970s, I think, in a fictional former British colony that has recently gained independence. And one of their new laws and one of their sort of leading differences from Britain is that they have introduced the law of the fixed period, which says that the correct amount of time to live is 68 years. So on your 67th birthday, you are transferred to a college where you live out the final year of your life, and on your 68th birthday, you are euthanized and cremated. And the fact that they're cremated is actually weirdly important because cremation was still very taboo kind of in the 1880s in Britain. So the idea not only that these people would be killed before their time, but the idea that they would be cremated sort of creates a lot of horror for all the characters in the book. And basically we're following the president of the society, Mr. Neverbend, who is very stubborn, as you might guess from his name, and he is in favour of the fixed period rule, but the country is quite young. Most of the inhabitants of this small island, which is I think somewhere near New Zealand, are quite young, so it's a few years before the first person turns 67, and when the first person turns 67, suddenly everyone realises what this rule might mean, and there's a lot of resistance to it, and we follow Mr. Neverbend and what happens from then on. What I don't know about the fixed period, what I cannot work out about it, is what Anthony Trollope thought. This book was published when Anthony Trollope was 67 years old, and he actually died before his 68th birthday. He passed away of a stroke, and his health was failing kind of in the years before this. And what I don't know was whether Anthony Trollope wrote this sort of satirical book about the fact that young people don't have enough respect for their elders, or whether he wrote it because he got to age 67 and was like, I've kind of had enough. Or maybe the whole fixed period thing is not the point at all. In a way, is it all about the fact that Mr. Neverbend, the president, is too stubborn, and that is his kind of tragedy? Does it actually not matter what the law is? I just don't know what Anthony Trollope was trying to say. Yeah, I don't know really what to make of the fixed period. It was fascinating, but it's a very atypical Anthony Trollope novel, so I don't think it would be a good place to start with him or anything like that. So yes, I'm making progress in trying to read all of Anthony Trollope's novels by the end of the year. Another classic I read in January was this. This is A Child of Sorrow by Zoilo Galang. This is a classic from the Philippines from 1921, and I have to say I didn't really like this very much. This wasn't really for me. So this is a sort of coming of age story, tragic love story about this young man who falls in love with a young woman. She is illegitimate, which kind of poses some difficulties around their potential marriage, and also her mother wants her to marry someone else, and it's about kind of everything that goes on from there. And it's got a very, like, you know, Romeo and Juliet, star-crossed lovers feel to it, and there's a lot of references to Romeo and Juliet, and we kind of know that things are probably not going to have a happy ending. Basically, I found the writing in this just incredibly overwrought. It's very, very like lyrical, poetic, over the top, and it just wasn't for me at all. I'm gonna see if I can find a passage to read for you. Oh, for the first kiss of woman, oh love, oh Venus, it is a theme that poets love to sing and to glorify in sublime and immortal poetry. It is the wine that intoxicates. Woman's first kiss is said to be one of the greatest events in life. It is a seal of the love like that of Juliet's to her Romeo, when two passionate lips dip into the sweet realm of the cup of love, while Cupid stands smiling and the angels in heaven sing of the faith of two loving souls. And a lot of the writing is quite like that, and that is just very, very much not the kind of writing I like to read. So I do think there were some interesting elements in this, but overall, it just wasn't really for me. And, you know, that's absolutely fine, and not all books are. Talking of books that weren't for me, and moving on to some historical fiction, I finally read A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, and I didn't like it that much, which I feel is quite a controversial opinion because this book is so beloved. So many people love this book. I don't think Amor Towles really needs me to love it as well. But yeah, okay, I have many thoughts about this. I'll try and be relatively succinct because I could be here all day discussing the many complexities of this book and the reasons why I didn't really like it. Which isn't to say I hated it. I gave it like no rating on Goodreads because I have no idea how I would rate it. Probably like 3 stars-ish, but really it was like some bits were 5 stars and some bits were 2 stars. A Gentleman in Moscow, if you don't know, is the story of a man called Count Rostov, who was a Russian count, and after the revolution in the early 1920s, no one really knows what to do with him because he was an aristocrat. But he wrote this poem many years ago, which was considered very revolutionary, and which a lot of people within the Communist Party loved and had inspired them. And so there was this kind of mix of respect for him because of this poem, and also dislike of him because he was an aristocrat. And so the Count ends up being placed under house arrest in the hotel in which he lives. And this book follows the Count over the several decades that he spends living in this hotel. So I read this for my historical fiction book club over on Patreon, and it was a really interesting one to read in a book club, partly because there's so much to discuss, and also partly because I think that made me think more about why I wasn't getting on with it than I might have done otherwise. And it was really interesting to read other people's opinion on this book. I think there were quite a few people who got on with it more than I did, but I think there were also quite a few people who had similar problems with kind of the pacing as I did. So I think there are a few different reasons why I didn't get on with this book. One is just that I didn't really like the writing style. Not that I think there's anything wrong with the writing style, it just really wasn't for me. I don't really know how to describe the writing style and what I didn't love about it. It reminded me actually in writing style of The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which I enjoyed and probably enjoyed more than A Gentleman in Moscow, but I remember finding the writing style just like not quite for me, and I felt the same with A Gentleman in Moscow. Like I just didn't gel with the writing style at all. I also found the pace very, very slow and the book very meandering. Like I didn't really know what this book was meant to focus on. I didn't really know what the point was. And I think there isn't really one, or there's so many points that it doesn't really matter. Like I think that's just the point of the book. There's so much to think about here, but it isn't really focused on one thing. But that's not what I love in a book. I like a book to have a bit more focus, which is a long way of saying it's probably a bit too literary for me. I think in some ways it's not that literary a book. Like I think it's very accessible, but I think in the sort of like meandering, ponderous, doesn't really have a point thing that you get in quite a lot of literary fiction, that is something I often struggle with. It was interesting when we were talking about it in the book club Discord, someone said that it reminded her of Still Life by Sarah Winman, which I also didn't really get on with for a lot of similar reasons, the kind of meandering, what do I focus on thing. So a lot of that is, you know, just personal taste. I also don't think I was like as charmed by the Count as a character as I was meant to be. He's quite a snob, and in general I feel like this book has quite like a rose-tinted view of aristocracy, and I wanted a little bit more like critique of that or awareness of that, which wasn't really here. That all sounds very, very negative. I do think there were some incredible moments in this book. The ending was amazing. Like the ending was truly fantastic, but I just wish the book had been like half the length before we got to the ending. And there were some amazing characters. I really liked Sophia. I thought she was really well done, and kind of her element of the story was great. I just wanted to get to that sooner because that for me was the focus of the book. But as I said, maybe it doesn't have a focus. Maybe that's not the point. I don't know. This is such a beloved book. And it just wasn't for me, and that's fine, isn't it? You know, not all books are for everyone. I was really hoping to love this a lot more than I did. But yeah, as I said, really interesting to read this for book club because there was a lot to discuss. Another novel I read in January, one of my long-term TBR books, was this. This is The Good Liars by Anita Frank. This is a work of historical fiction set in the early 1920s, and a lot of it is kind of looking at the aftermath of the First World War. We're following this family, a woman, her husband, his brother, and a family friend. They live in this big sort of crumbling house that they can't really afford to keep up anymore for various reasons that emerge throughout the book. The family are quite disliked in the kind of local surroundings, so they can't really get anyone to come and work as a servant at this house. We follow what happens when a young woman who's a nurse comes to work at this house, partly to look after one of the members of the family who was very injured during the First World War. And then strange, unexplained things start to happen in this house, and we realise they may have some connection with things that happened during the First World War and also with the disappearance of a boy from the neighbourhood before the First World War. It is such a fascinating book. A lot of it is looking kind of the impact of the First World War. Everyone within this household has been really impacted by the war in different ways, and I feel like the way that's explored is fascinating. It's a very like sinister gothic novel. If you're looking for likeable characters, this isn't going to be one for you. Like, so many of the characters are awful, but you know, they're meant to be awful, and I think they're fantastically drawn. How I hated Ida and Victor, but it was very enjoyable to hate them. I thought this was a really interesting, complicated novel, looking really fascinatingly at this particular point in time, and the twists and turns of the plot are excellent. So yeah, really enjoyed this one. Then I also read A Fortune Most Fatal by Jessica Bull. This is a historical crime novel. This is a proof copy, so this is coming out in March, and I absolutely loved this one. So this is the second book in the Miss Austen Investigates series. The first book is just called Miss Austen Investigates, and I absolutely loved that too, so I knew I was going to really enjoy this, and it was excellent. So in this book, young Jane Austen goes to stay with her wealthy brother Edward, and while there she learns that Edward's adoptive mother, you probably don't need a long and complicated history of the Austen family, but one of Jane Austen's elder brothers in his early teens, I think, was adopted by some wealthy relations who didn't have children of their own. Anyway, Jane arrives to stay with her brother Edward, and learns that his adoptive mother has a young woman staying with her who claims she is a princess. And Jane and her brother think maybe she is a con woman, and then we follow Jane as she tries to work out who this woman is and what her plan is, etc. I just really loved this. I love Jess Bull's writing. I love her pacing. I really love the way she creates Jane Austen and the people around her, both the kind of fictional and the real characters. And it's really lovely, you know, as someone who loves Jane Austen and who's read biographies and letters and, you know, that kind of thing, it's really lovely to read a Jane Austen character who feels like my image of Jane, and also all the characters around her as well. I really enjoyed. I love Mrs. Knight, Edward's adoptive mother. I thought she was so well done, and I really, really liked her as a character. She was great. I also really liked the balance of like the, you know, the Regency fun, the balls and bonnets, but also all the like darker, grittier stuff going on beneath that beautiful, glorious facade of like Regency upper class society. I thought it did a really good job of looking at like the darker side of stuff at this point in time, and yeah, overall just thought this was really, really great. Would highly recommend when it comes out in March. Talking of historical mysteries, I also reread The Murder Wheel by Tom Mead, right back at the beginning of January. I was listening to this on audiobook while doing long drives over Christmas and New Year, and just finished it at the very beginning of January. I really love Tom Mead's series. They are all locked room mysteries set in the 1930s, which is really good fun. And because they're locked room mysteries, the solutions are often quite like technical and clever and fiddly, so it's always quite interesting to reread those kind of books and like see the clues along the way. So The Murder Wheel is a really fun murder mystery in that it's set like over just 24 hours, I think, which is something I really like in a book. We're following a solicitor who is involved in the defence of a woman who has been accused of murdering her husband on a Ferris wheel. No one else could possibly have done it because they were in the air at the time, but the question is, of course, why would someone choose to kill someone in a place where they would be the obvious suspect? So Id, as a solicitor, is trying to work out possible lines of defence, and then we follow kind of what goes on from there. Really, really enjoyed this one. Really fun to reread, and yes, as I said, I do really enjoy this series a lot. Another one I listened to on audiobook in January was Herc by Fwenica Rogerson. This is a Greek myth retelling, retelling the story of Hercules or Heracles from the perspective of an awful lot of different characters, none of whom are Hercules, which was great. That was such a fun premise and worked really well. I listened to this in the audiobook, as I said, and I would really recommend the audiobook because it has a really big cast, and there are different voice actors doing every different character, which works really well. This book looks at the story of Hercules kind of from his birth, and we're getting all these kind of like different reports and accounts from various different characters. I really loved the way this book plays with form, and I thought it did a really good job of creating a very complicated character in Hercules, and also at using the different narrative voices and perspectives and kind of the unreliable narrators within that to kind of explain certain discrepancies within mythology, I suppose, which is quite fun. I thought the way this book played with form and voice was just wonderful, and the characterization was excellent. So yes, I would really, really recommend Herc. Really strong Greek myth retelling with a fantastic audiobook. The other book from my long-term TBR that I read in January was The Girl on the 88 Bus by Freya Sampson. I knew I was going to love this book. When I worked at the publisher Zaffa many years ago, I worked on Freya Sampson's first book, The Last Library, which I loved working on. It was so much fun. So I knew I was going to really enjoy The Girl on the 88 Bus, and it's just taken me too long to get to. And this was so delightful and warm and lovely and heartwarming, but also with some really serious themes explored really well. I laughed and cried, and it was beautiful. So The Girl on the 88 Bus is about a young woman called Libby. She's 29 years old. Her long-term boyfriend has just split up with her, and she ends up moving in with her sister, living in her sister's spare room in London. And one day on the bus, she meets a man called Frank, an elderly man who tells her that he rides the bus all the time because he is looking out for a young woman who he met on the bus many, many years ago, and they had a conversation which changed his life. She wrote her number on her bus ticket and gave it to him, but he lost it on the way home and never managed to make contact with her again, and he has been looking for her ever since. And so Libby, who is at a loose end and wants something to distract her, says to Frank, well, I will help you find your girl on the 88 bus. And they start a kind of like campaign to try and find her. And that's the kind of heart of the book, but there are also a lot of other characters that Libby meets along the way who have an impact on her life. Frank is also at the beginning of dementia, and kind of that is explored in, I thought, a really sensitive, powerful way. There was also a plot element that I really wasn't expecting that came in part of the way through, and I thought that was a really great element to the novel. And overall, I just really loved this. It was so delightful and so, yeah, heartwarming, but also like complicated and looking at a lot of really interesting themes, and I just loved it so much. So I'd highly recommend The Girl on the 88 Bus. What a wonderful book it was. Then finally, I also read some poetry in January. I read Gold from the Stone by Lem Sissay. Overall, I quite liked this. I wouldn't say that Lem Sissay's style of poetry is necessarily my favourite style of poetry, although I can imagine, I think he also does a lot of stuff as a performance poet, and some of the poems I could imagine I would get more out of read aloud, especially I think he uses like quite a lot of repetition, and that is much more effective aloud often than it is on the page. I would also say this is an anthology, so it's a kind of bind up of a lot of his poetry, and it's like 200 pages, and I do think that with poetry I often get on with a kind of short collection of like 50 to 100 pages better than I do with a sort of collected works or anthology. I just get on with shorter bursts of poetry more. So I don't know, I did enjoy a lot of the poems, and I do think like thematically this was fascinating. I'd be really interested to read Lem Sissay's memoir, My Name is Why, but I'm not sure that I will necessarily go out and read a ton more of his poetry. But I am glad I read this, and hopefully I will continue trying to read a bit more poetry in 2025. So those are the books that I read in January. Successful reading month, lots of great books read. So yes, do let me know down in the comments what you read in January. What were your highlights of the month? Have you read any of the books I've spoken about today? What did you think of them? Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.